Hello, I'm Zack Stanton.
And I'm Adam Wren, and it's Friday, May 30th.
And this is the Playbook Podcast. If we sound a bit different this morning, it's because we're coming to you live from the Mackinac Policy Conference here in northern Michigan. And you may hear some sounds in the background, birds chirping or horses clopping by or conference attendees chattering, but that's the sound here on the ground. We'll talk more about the national lessons from the political conversations we've been having this week in just a second. But first, without further ado, here are the topics driving the day. The first story driving Washington's conversation today comes from the mother of all swing states, Pennsylvania, where President Donald Trump is scheduled to host a big rally to celebrate U.S. Steel's acquisition by Nippon Steel, or as Trump is calling it, a planned partnership between the Japanese and U.S. firm. Now, this is a bit of a surprise. When Nippon announced the deal back in 2023, Trump quickly came out against it, saying he would block it if he were president. But he backtracked in light of the fact that as president, he wants to maintain blue-collar support and preserve jobs in Western Pennsylvania. Adam, when he speaks today in Pennsylvania, are we expecting anything different from a standard Trump rally? Or are recent examples, say his speech at West Point, examples of the sort of blurring of the lines here between the presidential and the political?
Yeah, I think we can look to the West Point as a template for what he's going to say here. I am curious about how he's going to square the circle when it comes to accounting for his opposition to this during the campaign. People like Senator Todd Young, a kind of moderate Republican from Indiana, are praising this deal. This deal would have cost jobs in Pennsylvania and Indiana. So curious to hear how he's going to reference that or phrase that. I do think it's of a piece with other decisions he's making, realizing that Vladimir Putin in Russia is not easy to deal with on the Ukraine issue as he thought he was in the campaign. So we are seeing sort of the forces of the presidency reshape candidate Trump in his second term.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The conversation already is, even though we're only 4 months into his presidency, to some degree, there is chatter, certainly in Washington, about 2028 implications of not only this, but more broadly, other moves that are happening. Democrats are inching closer tonight to the 2028 conversation. There's the Blue Palmetto dinner in South Carolina, which will have dueling appearances from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Maryland Governor Wes Moore, both of whom are rumored to be considering bids in 2028. Are we expecting that Tim Walz will get a hero's welcome? Is Wes Moore running? We can expect that the tea leaves are going to be read on all of this, and probably read into far too much. But that's sort of politics at this moment in time. What is the 2028 conversation looking like? Are you expecting that to change at all in light of the South Carolina conversation?
Yeah, and we can't forget that all this is happening in the aftermath of the Jake Tapper, Alex Thompson book, which has a blast radius here. The people who were closest to the Biden-Harris campaign, the Harris-Walz campaign, have sort of the most to account for. And so it'll be interesting to see whether Walz references that or not. And then you have someone like Wes Moore, who, was pretty far removed, even though he was supportive of the ticket, was pretty far removed from the everyday machinations of the White House and the vice president. And so, he kind of has a clear path here to paint on a blank canvas and to be unencumbered by this book and its claims. And so I'm fascinated to see how he'll use that canvas tonight and what he'll say.
Yeah, and the outlook for Democrats, both nationally and locally, was never too far from the conversations we've been having all this week. The third thing that I would focus on today, and sort of the biggest topic that we're going to talk about, is here on Mackinac Island, where Adam and I have been all week reporting from the Mackinac Policy Conference, which, for lack of a better comparison, is sort of like a Coachella for Midwestern swing state politics. We've been having conversations with folks in key offices and key political players. And I'm curious, Adam, to start big picture here, Michigan has an open U.S. Senate seat with likely competitive primaries in both parties. It has an open gubernatorial race, also likely with competitive primaries in both parties. It has multiple competitive U.S. House races and is, of course, a major swing state with national implications. What is the outlook for 2026 that you're hearing based on your conversations this week?
Yeah, Zach. So yesterday I talked with Representative Bill Huizenga, who is on the west side of the state, represents a Republican swing seat. And it's one of those seats that you want a good proven candidate in. But he's considering a Senate run against Mike Rogers, the other Republican, looking at the Senate primary, who has had the path paved for him by the NRSC. But Huizenga potentially getting in this summer, he tells us, could disrupt plans in the House where Republicans already have a thin majority. But broadly, I get a really confident sense from Michigan Democrats that's quite different from the tone that we're hearing from national Democrats. They love Gretchen Whitmer, as you reported earlier this week. They're happy with her performance. She has support from sort of the centrist business community that we've picked up on. And so it seems like national Democrats could learn a lot from the tone and tenor that we're hearing from Democrats here, focusing on the economy, focusing on prices. And I'm curious whether or not national Democrats will indeed pick up on some of these messaging cues that seem to be working right now, at least for Democrats in the state that they lost not too long ago.
You alluded to Gretchen Whitmer's favorability, and right now she has a job favorability rating in Michigan that's 63%, according to a poll that we had in Playbook earlier this week. And that was really the topic of conversation that we've been having a lot here, is the gulf between what national Democrats feel is good politics and a good way to approach Trump versus what actually appears to be the case on the ground in swing states and key places where the party needs to win. And it's part of this gulf that's really struck me this week, time and again, is how listless the party seems nationally, the Democratic Party seems nationally, compared to how on top of its game it seems in competitive states like Michigan, like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania. And this real split between the national politics and the localized politics. And I'm curious, what exactly that's going to mean for Democrats. You and I spoke with Kristen McDonald-Rivet, Congresswoman from the Flint area in Genesee, and her district is actually the median for partisanship, the median U.S. House district nationally. There are 217 seats more Republican than it, 217 seats more Democratic than it. And I'm curious, based on that conversation and the other conversations, what is it that you're hearing from Democrats in places where the party needs to win and make inroads to win back some of those voters who trended away and went for Donald Trump?
Yeah, Zach, I found that conversation with McDonald-Rivet to be fascinating. She told us that 80% of the household incomes in her district are $50,000 or below. And so you really get a sense for how families are dealing with these inflationary costs, tariffs and their impact on retailers like Walmart. I'm interested to see kind of how she talks about that going forward and whether national Dems echo that. But she really continued to talk about kind of these post-inflationary or continued inflationary price stresses that the average American family are feeling. I thought it was interesting the way that she talked about how her people in her district came to talk to her about Musk and the quote chaos, end quote, as she called it, that he caused in his reign in Washington. I thought it was funny that she told us that many of her constituents came up to us and referenced the video of Musk at CPAC holding a chainsaw. And many of them told her, that's not how you hold a chainsaw. And so the takeaway from that was interesting. And it does communicate that Donald Trump won her district by 2 points and she won it by 7 points. And so the fact that people who may have voted for her and Donald Trump are coming up to her and kind of expressing a little bit of frustration with how Musk and Trump have run Washington so far in the first 100 days and beyond. I think that's telling for kind of the mood music that we're going to be hearing as we head in closer to the midterms.
And then if you're thinking really big picture here, what are the sort of 2026 takeaways writ large that you are taking away from this week here in Michigan?
I think for starters is that the online left on X are disconnected with a lot of primary voters. I mean, Michigan is likely to be an early state in 2028. They voted 5th last time. And for someone like Whitmer, who it's unclear what she's going to do, a candidate like her, let's say, would have a lot of support in an early state like Michigan, the last early state that would vote, unless the calendar changes again. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Trump does have a midterm problem in Michigan, which is one of the most crucial battleground states. You have people like John James running for governor and vacating a seat that he's a good candidate in and should be a hold for Republicans, although it's swingy. And then the same thing with Bill Huizenga on the other side of the state. And so there's a tough path here for Republicans to keep the House, and it's not getting any easier with decisions that we're seeing from people like Huizenga to go further into a possible campaign.
Yeah, and Adam, I think it speaks to the fact that though in many ways being in Congress is a great job, a fantastic job to have, it's not always an enjoyable one to have, including if you're in the majority. You have to constantly be raising money, have to constantly be grinding away, and you're not even able to do that much legislating, even when you have a narrow majority as Republicans do. And so if you are a member of the House, particularly in a swingy seat that you're going to have to constantly raise money to defend, in many ways, running for governor or running for Senate is more appealing. That longer term is more appealing. And, the chance to be in a role where you're either an executive or one of fewer members allows you to really think about the splash that you can make. And that has an appeal for a whole lot of House Republicans. And I think that is another factor that's probably complicating their chances of holding on to the House majority right now.
Yeah, I think you're right, Zach. And, we've seen this all over the map, whether it's Lawler in New York, whether it's Stefanik, who sort of wants to leave the House as well. Trump is really sort of fascinated by the 2026 midterms, and he's working to keep kind of all of his best players in the spots where he most needs them to protect the majority and have a successful full 4-year term and not just his first 2 years or so.
I think that's right. In many ways, it'll be his last election in some sense, even though he won't be literally on the ballot. He's constitutionally prohibited from running for another term in 2028. So 2026 is in many ways the last election that he is going to play this sort of central role in, most likely, barring some major surprise. And so he wants to really make sure that he's able to hold on to the House. He's reportedly worried about the possibility of doing oversight investigations, which I think is almost a certainty if Democrats retake the House. And so there are real stakes to this beyond the policy stakes. There are real stakes for Donald Trump and for people in his administration. And that'll be something that I'm keeping my eye on. Adam, thanks. This was great.
Thanks, Zach.
And we always try to end the show with something more lighthearted from the Playbook newsletter. But in lieu of doing that, this week we want to give you a first taste of Dasha Byrne's new podcast that she's hard at work preparing for the very first episode of. It's a first look of The Conversation with Dasha Byrne. And her debut guest is Administrator for the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, Dr. Mehmet Oz. You can listen to it wherever you get your podcasts, but here's a taste.
We're not cutting Medicaid. I've seen the proposals. There is no proposal I've seen, in fact, fairness, that doesn't increase spending on Medicaid. So what this government is going to do.
So why are people like Hawley concerned? Because there's been a lot of confusion about the cuts. What do you read as his concern?
If you read the actual language that we're working with, it is designed for one major purpose: to allow the President of the United States and the governors who run the states to align on what we should be doing for the most vulnerable members of the population. There's a lot of sensitivity about being accused of not taking care of people who have disabilities or seniors without money or children. So, for example, take what's being called the work requirement, which is really a community and engagement.
I think the concern that some advocates have raised, though, is the administrative effort to manage that, to make sure that people are filling out the paperwork, to verify the paperwork. And some are concerned that is going to mean that some people lose their health insurance, and even for a time, if it means a delay in critical care, that could be.
Dasha, it's an excellent question. But this is where I do think we have an obligation, all of us in government, to do a better job.
Yeah.
If the reason not to do something that we all think we should do is we don't think we're capable or competent to do it, that's a problem.
And that's it for today's show. We have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. We'll be back Monday. Have a great weekend.